A big question when it comes to retirement is whether or not you'll have the resources you need to pay for everything. So you need to have some realistic expectations of what your costs will look like. What will you spend on food and fun, travel and healthcare, taxes on withdrawals, and everything else that might come up. And then you factor in inflation, and then you can take a look at, do you have the assets and the income to support that type of spending? So for right now, we'll focus on the cost side of things, and we're going to touch on the biggest spending categories. We'll also look at some tools you can use to get some realistic expectations. Those will be linked to in the description below, but with those tools, you can figure out roughly how much other people spend or what you might expect to spend. And naturally, this all depends on your health and your location and your lifestyle, but you can start with some good informed guesses and then refine that as things go on. So these are the most popular spending categories that a lot of things fall into, and we'll start with your general budget. So in many cases, your retirement spending might be similar to your current spending level. At least that might be a goal, or we don't want you to have to make sacrifices or reduce your standard of living in retirement. So there are a couple of ways to look at this. One is called a replacement ratio. It's not exactly my favorite, but it's worth looking at. This is where you say, I want to replace a portion of my income, typically some percentage, like 80 or 90%, for example, of my current income. And you say, well, I'm not going to spend as much on commuting to work, for example. I won't pay payroll taxes. Maybe I don't need 100% of my current gross income, but I can take some percentage of that and aim for that as my spending level in retirement. You can also look at your current spending levels in a couple of different ways. And I've got other videos on this, by the way, that get into it in more detail. But one way to go is to look at a bottom-up view of your spending. And that's where you basically look at your budget and see where money goes every month and assume that you'll have most of those same costs. Of course, there will be some changes, but assume that you're going to spend on the same things after you retire that you spend money on today. Alternatively, you could go with a top-down view, and that's where you're going to take your total income. So you might start with your pay stubs from your W-2 or your tax return. Then we subtract out any savings that you do. So if you put money into retirement accounts or savings accounts, we would reduce those amounts out, and the rest is all of your spending and taxes. So some of those taxes are going to go away. So your payroll taxes, for example, are not something you would continue to pay after you stop working. But the point being, we take your total income minus your savings. That equals total outflows. It goes somewhere. We don't know exactly where it goes, but it is going somewhere. And if you want to keep the same standard of living, we want to be able to fund roughly that same outflow, maybe minus payroll taxes or any other adjustments that are going to come up in retirement. So what are some of those potential adjustments? Well, one might be, for example, your mortgage. If you pay that off at some point, you would no longer have the principal and interest portion of the payment, although the taxes and insurance or maybe HOA dues would continue to be expenses that you face in retirement. Or you might travel more. You might say, once I stop working, I'm going to spend more on travel than I have previously because I'll have more time. You might go out to eat more. You might just change a number of different things. So you want to build those into your assumptions as you look at costs in retirement. Another source of information that might be helpful is to use surveys. So this could be especially helpful if you're thinking of moving or if you just want to compare how your expenses might look to other people and just get a wild guess on what expenses could look like. You can say, look, we've got 2 adults here, no children in the household, assuming you're retiring. That's often the case. What do people typically spend on these different categories? And that can give you a ballpark guess. And you can look at different areas if you're considering relocation. Then it's also important to look at inflation and typical retiree behavior as you build out your assumptions. So inflation is, of course, the phenomenon of prices rising over time. For example, we have some hard-hitting economic data here. A pound of chocolate chip cookies in 1980 was about $1.50, and that has gradually climbed, especially recently, and it's now $4.60 or so for that same pound of chocolate chip cookies. If you think back to other things like what you might have paid for housing in the past and several decades ago, it might seem laughably low. So inflation is certainly something to take seriously. That said, retirees don't necessarily spend at a rate that just marches up blindly with inflation. And that's based on several different theories and some research. So you, for example, have housing costs, and that's part of the inflation calculation. So you might have a fixed rate mortgage, but your mortgage payment isn't necessarily going up, and you're not paying rent, or you're not facing a landlord who's going to increase your housing cost at the next renewal. Your housing cost is generally fixed, at least for now. So another way of looking at it is what's called the retirement spending smile. That's based on research from David Blanchett. If I could summarize it, I'll basically say that he found that retirees spend at a rate of roughly inflation minus 1%. So as you do your retirement projections, you're going to assume that inflation happens at a certain rate, and your spending, at least in some categories, might happen at a slightly slower rate. That's what I do with clients when I'm doing retirement projections. I typically look at it a number of different ways. One is with that blind inflation adjustment. It just keeps on going up and we're not looking at anything else. But we also look at the retirement spending smile, although in that case, I do like to have healthcare costs inflate at a faster rate because that just seems to be an issue for retirees. One other theory is the go-go, the slow-go, and the no-go years. And that is where you say, right after you retire, you're into your go-go years. You have stopped working, you have this free time, you have energy and the desire to do a lot of the things that you've been waiting to do. So you spend money on those things at a relatively higher rate. But when we get into the slow go years, you've accomplished more, you're less interested in 8-hour flights or whatever, and you might spend slightly less. Eventually, we get into the no-go years where really you're not spending a whole lot on travel and entertainment, but those healthcare costs are tending to ramp up for you in some cases. All of that to say that you want to think about how your future might unfold. So there is inflation to contend with, and at the same time, we often see that retirees don't necessarily match inflation perfectly. A couple of different patterns can potentially come into play. We even see this in government data. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics looks at how much people are spending, average annual expenditures, age 55 to 64. It's at roughly this level. Let's say 65 to 74, there's a bit of a decrease. And at 75 and over, it's even more of a decrease. Now, that's no guarantee that that's what things will look like for you. And again, we have to remember those healthcare costs, although Medicare can cover surprisingly a lot. But again, you just want to think about different ways things could unfold. By the way, I'm Justin Pritchard, and I help people plan for retirement and invest for the future. And in the description below, you're going to find a lot of resources, a couple of links to the things that we've looked at here, as well as some bigger picture retirement planning resources. So I think you will find those very helpful. Be sure to check all of that out. This is also time for a quick friendly reminder that it's just a short video. It can't possibly cover everything, and it's not individualized advice. Please read this very carefully and check with some professionals before you make any big decisions. Now on to healthcare costs. Let's look at the landscape as well as some specific tools and surveys you can use to get some numbers that you might want to put into your own calculations. So healthcare happens in a couple of different ways. Before age 65, if you retire before that age, a couple of things could happen. Number one, you might continue on with retiree healthcare from your employer. You might use COBRA or your state's continuation program to continue with the coverage you previously had for up to 18 months in most cases. That can get quite expensive, but worth looking at. You might also buy your own coverage, maybe through an insurer or through a marketplace or exchange. And when you do that, you might be able to potentially get some very low costs if you have a relatively low income. That's if you get your plan through the exchange or marketplace and you qualify for some subsidies. And finally, if you have a spouse and that person happens to be covered and you can get on their coverage, it's typically a qualifying event when you leave your job and lose your coverage, that might make sense to continue with their plan. So let's take a look at some of those potential savings if you use a marketplace plan. This is a tool from the Kaiser Family Foundation that can help you estimate some costs, and you can, play with this. I'll put a link in the description, put in your location, but if you're using a marketplace plan, you can pick different levels of income. Let's just say it's one person, age 61, just for giggles. And so they might be able to save about $750 a month at that level of income from a premium tax credit. And of course, you'd want to learn about exactly how those work. But if the income was higher, maybe they are doing some part-time work or some Roth conversions or something like that, that might drop down to about $254 per month in terms of the premium tax credit that they're getting. So as you estimate your healthcare costs in retirement, part of it is going to be the premiums you pay. And here we are before age 65, and those premiums, or the effective premium, is going to depend on your income level in some cases. Fidelity also has a pretty cool tool, and this is going to help us transition to once we get into Medicare age, but we'll start before Medicare, and we're going to have a single woman, age 62, because that's where I landed, and she's going to retire today, live till 93. So her healthcare cost is going to be a decent amount for this year. So for her first year of retirement, she's paying roughly $12,000. But if she's going to make it until, let's say, age 65 or so, you see how that drops off quite a bit, because and they have a little warning sign pops up here. But once you are eligible for Medicare, then your costs typically drop quite a bit. So let's talk about Medicare now. And by the way, that's assuming she didn't qualify for any tax subsidies. Once you reach age 65, that's typically when you're eligible for Medicare. It can happen at different ages and different circumstances, but that's really the ballpark age. So you do want to enroll several months, or at least get the ball rolling several months ahead of time to avoid any penalties. Those can be lifetime penalties that add costs to your coverage, so you don't want that. You also want to be mindful of your income starting at around age 63, and that's because your Medicare premiums look back a couple of years. They look back 2 years prior to what your income was, and if you had quite a high income, then that can lead to higher premiums. But in general, once you're on Medicare, health coverage can be quite affordable unless you have some really serious health issues. Even then, you may be able to put a cap on your total out-of-pocket spending by using supplemental type plans. So you have a couple of different options available. You really want to talk with an insurance broker who specializes in Medicare and can help you figure out, given your situation, what might make the most sense for you. To get a ballpark estimate of what those costs might look like and the ranges and the components that might go into it, we've got the Vanguard Mercer healthcare study. The latest out right now is the 2020. We've got a 65-year-old woman here just on original Medicare. If she has, let's say, high risk, I believe this is about 2 conditions. So a couple of conditions that she's got to deal with. You might even be healthier, but a high risk person, let's say, might be paying $5,700 out of pocket total. So that's made up of some premiums as well as your out-of-pocket costs. So remember that Medicare does not cover everything. So you've got to pay for dental, vision in particular, and a number of other things as well. So your total out-of-pocket costs, are going to depend on your conditions. If you don't have any type of way to cap your costs, they could get quite high. So if you are in the worst 95th percentile, that's what this particular study found. This is, no guarantee of what you might experience or anything like that, but just some ballpark numbers here from that study. Or if you, happen to use some type of supplemental plan, you would end up paying higher premiums, but you might expect to be able to reduce your risk of out-of-pocket costs. So that's going to be something you'll want to discuss with a health insurance agent who, again, specializes in Medicare. Next, we come to long-term care costs, and this is one of the most difficult parts when it comes to retirement planning. We don't know if you're going to need care or how long it will last or exactly what type of care you'll need. Are you going to have somebody come in a couple times a week to clean things up and cook some meals? Or are you going to be living in memory care with 24-hour supervision? As you can imagine, the prices on those vary dramatically. So you can get some rough estimates through this GE cost of care survey, and you can pick your area if you want. Let's say you're in the Denver metro area, and they might say that the monthly median costs there, so homemaker services, 6,800 bucks a month. But if you are in a private room, for example, it can quickly go up from there. So get an idea of what things might look like in your area, and you can make some estimates of what type of care you might need. Obviously, there's no way to predict that, but this is something you might want to build into your plan. And from there, you can start thinking about how you might want to fund that, or if you even want to think about trying to fund that. There are a number of different options. You can consider earmarking assets that you currently have saved up or that you're saving up. You can earmark those for potential long-term care costs. There are insurance policies that come in a number of different flavors that could potentially assist with that. You could think of your home equity perhaps as a way to fund some long-term care costs. There are a number of different things to think about. Next, we have taxes, and those can be a potential cost in retirement that come as a surprise. You might think that once you stop working, you're no longer paying taxes. That is in fact not the case. So you are often going to pay taxes on pensions that you receive. A portion of your Social Security could be taxable, although if you're a glass half full type of person, at least 15% would be tax-free. It kind of just depends on your income level. So these are things that you want to look into. Your distributions from pre-tax retirement accounts are typically taxable, or at least they get included as potentially taxable income. So that's going to be your deductible IRAs, any pre-tax 401k, 403b balances that you have saved up. Those types of things could cause you to pay taxes, and they could affect other parts of your tax return and your finances. Those Roth accounts can potentially create tax-free income, and so that way, if you meet all of the IRS requirements, you would not pay income tax on distributions you take, and those don't interfere with other things on your tax return or your finances as well. So that can be really helpful. And there are some strategies you can use to manage when and how much you pay in taxes. So sometimes people think about Roth conversions, and there are pros and cons of that, of course. By the way, I've got another video on this that talks about just this taxation and retirement topic by itself, so I'll try to remember to make that pop up above here. When we get to your taxable accounts, those typically can create some tax liability for you, and that might be biggest when you sell something that has gained a lot of value. Hopefully you have some of that in your portfolio, things that you bought long ago and have gained value, and you might have a capital gain on. So you want to be thinking about what is the tax impact of that type of transaction. There are a couple of ways to manage the taxes that you pay in retirement. In particular, it might make sense to pay some taxes even before you are required to. I hinted at those Roth conversions, and that would be when you take money from pre-tax retirement accounts and pay taxes intentionally to get it into a Roth. And the result of that, if you meet all the requirements, is future tax-free income. Or if you actually need the money for spending, you can just withdraw and fill the tax brackets. That might make sense if you're in a relatively low tax bracket today. So chat with a CPA or with a financial planner and see if those types of strategies make sense before you make any decisions. You can also reduce your tax costs in retirement with general tax-efficient investing strategies. So that's avoiding a lot of short-term capital gains, maybe avoiding high turnover. Maybe you want to do that, maybe you don't. That's up to you as an investor, but it's generally going to be tax efficient to use more passive type instruments as you invest your money. You can also look towards things like maybe delaying Social Security, which gives you time to fill those tax brackets, take distributions, or do Roth conversions. You might want to think about if you give to charity, does it make sense to do so in certain tax-friendly ways? Maybe you're giving highly appreciated securities that have gained a lot of value, giving those to charity. Maybe you're giving money directly out of your IRA to a qualifying charity. Again, that's assuming that you meet the requirements to do so. That's a qualified charitable distribution or a QCD. But all that said, there are ways to manage some of these costs so that you end up with more after tax spending money or more money that goes to the causes that you value. So I hope you found that helpful. If you did, please leave a quick thumbs up. Thank you and take care.